Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1052nd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the huge pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Kenny Rivero and Onnesha Roychoudhuri. And now I'll introduce our guest and host for today. Kenny Rivero's work, which spans painting, collage, drawing, and sculpture, explores the complexity of identity through narrative images, language, and symbolism. His process also allows him to explore what he perceives as the broken narrative of Dominican-American identity, socio-geographic solidarity, familial expectations, race, and gender roles. He is the recipient of numerous residencies and awards, including Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant, among others. Onnesha Roychoudhuri is a writer, speaker, and educator with over 15 years of experience working at the intersection of narrative and social justice. Her work, which seeks to examine and disrupt limiting narratives around identity, agency, and power, has appeared in publications including Rolling Stone, The Nation, and Mother Jones. She has read and performed on stages across the country and has been awarded residencies and fellowships from many organizations. Onnesha is the author of The Marginalized Majority, Claiming Our Power in a Post-Truth America. She's currently an assistant professor of English creative writing at Colby College. Onnesha and Kenny, thank you so much for joining us here today, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to you to get us started, Onnesha.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, huge thanks to Eleanor and Chloe for having us here at the Rail. And actually, yeah, could you pull up that first slide? Because what I want to do is just very briefly, while we look at this work, I just want to read something very short that I wrote about Kenny elsewhere. So I'll just start off by by jumping in here. The first time I met Kenny Rivero in his studio in 2021, he gave me a quick tour that ended with both of us facing a large work in progress, Olafs and Calizos. The painting looked like it could have been finished or nearly so. I didn't yet understand that the word finished doesn't really have a place in Rivero's lexicon. Here, he said, handing me a paintbrush, paint something. I insisted I didn't want to ruin his work. He insisted I wouldn't. I laid down a thin layer of gray paint, tracing a small section of the curved base of a large brown hand. I figured it might be able to pass as a subtle shadow. I put the brush down and looked at Rivero. He was staring intently at the canvas. Finally, he spoke. Oh no. I couldn't tell whether he was joking or not. The 72-inch by 72-inch painting sold soon after. The gray line is still there. This early encounter captures much of what makes Rivero a compelling artist and human. His work, as well as his approach to it, is both deadly serious and deeply playful. So yeah, and this is the painting, and in the bottom right hand of that
Yeah.
hand, you can see the little gray bit of paint there.
Yeah.
But I just love that this is sort of like an origin story of my introduction to Kenny's work, and was so excited when this beautiful new monograph of his came out called "I'm Not a Player" or "I'm Not a Painter." Wow, the original lyrics are in my head. I'm not a painter, I just brush a
Yeah.
lot. And yeah, just really excited to like celebrate this work. It's gorgeous. I mean, I think maybe just to start off, I would love to hear you talk, Kenny, about like, first of all, I love that this book is titled "I'm Not a Painter" and it's full of paintings. I mean, among other things, but there's like a real pushback, a real playfulness around like how you're labeled or categorized. So just maybe start off by talking a little bit about how the monograph came about and also how you landed on this title.
Awesome. Okay, so I mean, thank you everyone. Thank you, Chloe and Eleanor for having us. This is amazing, and this is also kind of like um the first time a nation and I are really kind of doing something together. So it's a really like great moment to think about like this body of work that for the most part I started when I met you. And it's kind of like, culminating into this book. So to be in conversation with you at this point is really amazing. Um, What was the question? So yeah, so I'm not a painter, so I think a lot about being an artist and thinking about what that means in terms of like just having a creative life. I think my practice is much more diverse than what's presented and what's kind of been like the visible part of my career or my creative life. And I resent that a little bit. I think that there's so much that happened in the paintings that don't come from painting. They come from other things that I do, like being a musician, collecting things, loving comedy, and so many things that kind of like feed this painting practice. So to call them paintings also feels unfair. For me, they're kind of devices and objects that end up absorbing all the creative things that I'm interested in. So they're documents in a lot of ways to like the real practice, which is like the things that happen in the studio that you can't really bring to like a gallery or museum space. So thinking about like, definitely, the humor of it kind of aligning with Big Pun's lyrics of I'm not a player, I just F word a lot. Um, it's thinking about being various and leading into kind of that various identity and being kind of a real human and not just this kind of um, painter, which for me, it's like, it has so much to do with a market. And if you think
Yeah.
about paintings originally, they're mobile frescoes, and they were made to, be able to like have a fresco in your home. So they're a market object by nature. Um,
Yeah, I
but I
love,
also think
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. No, you go, you go.
So I just love the way you put that like the work is what happens in the studio. Or like the
Hmm.
work is what's happening, and like the final product or whatever it is that like is more like out in the world and audience facing, that's just almost like a relic, a remnant of this broader process. And it's something that I really appreciate about the way you talk about artwork. And I just want to echo what you said. Like, it's so lovely to be able to be in conversation finally in a more public
Hmm.
facing way, because this is, you know, like our years long friendship. It feels like this ongoing conversation about process and about what it means to be an artist and about what it means to create work. And I think you frequently hone in on, you know, I know, like as a writer myself, and just going through times of struggling with the piece that I'm working on, or like if I'm not being published for a stretch of time, this doubt around like, am I an
Hmm.
artist? And I feel like you're consistently um, kind of reframing that both for yourself and other people that you talk to, where you're just like, well, wait a minute, like, what about fixing up the house? What about cleaning? And I know you talk about cleaning your studio and like the ritual of that. And there's just this real reverence for all of the unseen things, or like at least unseen to a broader public, that go into a life of artwork.
Hmm.
Is that something you feel like you see echoed among, you know, peers of yours and other artists, or do you feel like that's kind
Uh,
of something you, yeah, bring to the table that is unique?
I don't think it's unique. I think a lot of artists think this way. Like a lot of artists that I appreciate are also have this kind of like shamanistic practice where it really is about like the ritual and like the detritus of that ritual, and
Yeah.
the kind of the result of engaging with things as opposed to like having this like hierarchy where you're controlling the material to do one thing. It's about like having a conversation and being in dialogue with objects, with paint, with surface, which is what cleaning is. Cleaning is like it calibrates me to what I did the day before. It's like, how did this little pile of dust happen? And I have to think about that. I have to reflect on like, oh, it must have been Ava running across the room combined with me like eating pizza and dropping a few crumbs, and like there's a story.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like unpacking those stories by paying attention and by being present. Also, I think the sensibility of all the unseen kind of things that make their way into the work is so connected to being a musician and also being an athlete. I'm not saying that like I'm an athlete, but I have kind of played softball for a little while, and like I play music and I play drums, and it's thinking about um like Steph Curry. You're not seeing the 30 million jump shots he's doing during practice, but you see the game and you see the result of it.
Yeah.
So for me to think about like, oh, the real work is in the studio and the paintings are like the result. I'm not reducing the paintings to something less, but it's a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
When they get installed into a show, I'm for the most part working on that show in the gallery like the day before, because there's things you just can't see in the studio that suddenly appear in, you know, the installation space.
Yeah.
Similar to like a baseball game or a performance on stage one night at a gig. It's like the audience kind of changes the circuit. So you have to really kind of adjust in a way that you can't adjust in the studio or when you're practicing alone in a room, you know?
Yeah. So now that we're seeing some of your drawings up here,
Hmm.
which I know is like how you started off, is like as primarily identifying as someone who draws. And so with like a drawing like this, you know, there's a lot of text that makes its way into these drawings in particular. Is that something, first of all, I'd just love to hear you talk about like your relationship to drawing, because I know that's something that has kind of continued throughout your career. But
Hmm.
also like have words always kind of been integrated, like even when you were younger and you were drawing, did it come paired with text, and what's your relationship to that?
That's a good question. I mean, I haven't thought about this in a long time, and I feel like I've right now, this moment, I'm thinking of something that I haven't really thought of, but it's the idea that like when I was introduced to drawing, it was through comic books.
Yeah.
And it was also through like drawing on stuff. So like drawing on like my dad's notes, my brother's notes, my sister's notes. So for me, like I always had to kind of find a way to squeeze in like drawings into like things that had text on them.
Yeah.
And for me, like it was the same thing, like thinking about words on a page in a comic book and how that's kind of like composed in a very intentional way to kind of, you know, share space with like images. So for me, it really is about kind of seeing them as the same. Like I learned drawing before I learned writing, and I kind of learned both at the same time in kindergarten, like everyone does. So for me, they're like even writing is a form of drawing. Um, and writing is just like kind of when thinking about it as drawing, it's like somebody's like energy, it's somebody's like connection and like engagement with the page, and it's such a like intimate and beautiful experience when you're like handwriting things. Um,
Yeah.
so I think like not having the opportunity in real life anymore to handwrite so much, I think like I've taken to drawing as a way to kind of keep that practice up and to keep playing with letters and misspelling and like I love the idea of misspelling. And I love the idea of
Why do you love the
when
idea
in
of misspellings?
because it's like it's like DNA. It's like a trace of a person. It's a trace of a person's history with that word.
Yeah.
Like for me, the word weapons, I will never unsee the word weapons as weapons. You know, and that's the kind of thing that like I like to play with when I write the word weapons. I like to keep thinking about that.
Yeah.
And yeah, and not understanding I before E is huge for me. Like I still don't get it unless I write it with my actual hand.
Yeah.
Um, so things like that, like understanding relationships with letters and words, is something that I feel really close to when I write them out.
Yeah.
And having them, and also, you know, a lot of the times these like texts appear in the drawings or the paintings as note taking. So they're me kind of reflecting on something in that moment. So if I look at it, something in the future that I wrote, I probably won't know what it means or what it's referring to. But in that
Yeah.
moment, it meant something. So it's like doodling. It's like, you know, again, this immediacy, this like transfer of energy that's unfiltered, that's not being kind of seen through a lens of like painting, capital P, or art history, or this kind of larger legacy of making images. It's just like um it's intimate. It's like a personal kind of poetry drawing is what I feel like writing is or something.
Yeah, and I appreciate like what the notion that there's just like a sort of a quality. It's like images, words, like it's all forms that are expression.
Hmm.
And that can be in that, yeah, and that you can take letters and sort of take them apart to some extent to
Yeah.
not presume that the only meaning in them is like what that word itself means.
Right.
Could we go back to the last slide that I probably know Kevin. So
Hmm.
I just wanted to bring this back up because as you were, Kenny, as you were talking about sort of like your first drawing was like on your like siblings' notes and things like that and found materials. Like this is a perfect example of like a discarded
Hmm.
book cover, right? And I think
Hmm.
I'm interested in, because I know like narrative and story is so important to you. Like, how does working with these other objects that come from, you know, like are sort of reclaimed from what their original purpose was, like, how does that shape your sense of the story and narrative? And has that maintained in your practice over time? Because I know this is older, right? This drawing. Maybe.
2017.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like a few years older. Yeah. So a lot of the materials a lot of the like reclaimed and salvaged materials that I work on for drawing, come from things that I've collected since high school. So it's paper that I just like felt attached to because I just kind of, um, I feel like I'm really interested in like the aura and like the history of something and the fact that this was like, maybe somebody else's book and then somebody else's book before that, you know, and thinking about textbooks when we were growing up, how you had to kind of write your name and the thing and the year you went to school, like that little kind of index section.
Yeah.
Like seeing like 1981 and 1983, and then understanding that okay, me and my brother went to the same school, and me and my brother had this book when he was in third grade. And that's how I started, as a way to kind of be connected to like that larger history and be connected to kind of a larger story with other people and kind of in community. And I also think that there's yeah, just like actual trace and actual energy in these things. So when I'm drawing on them, it's about kind of having a dialogue with that and being in communion with that
Yeah.
larger community that's like not necessarily present.
Yeah, and I could see how like having something to respond and react and engage with, can
Hmm.
create this nice friction where like, good material comes out of that. But I also, as you're talking, I'm wondering if there's a way in which sometimes it can be overwhelming, right? Like you have these objects and like I haven't spent much time in your new studio, but I've seen your old studio where there's just so much stuff in there, right? And does
Hmm.
it like what's your relationship with stuff? Like with stuff from the past, and does it ever feel because like obviously there's so many opportunities and openings for engagement and dialogue, but are there times
Hmm.
where it feels almost like too much of an inheritance and you want just like a fresh start?
Yeah, I think both. I think there's, in one sense, I see myself kind of as a steward of these objects, as somebody who's kind of caretaking, and collecting as a way to kind of respond to, I don't know, like a negligence, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. Um, and sometimes that's like easy, sometimes that's really difficult. Sometimes I feel like I have to purge a lot of these things every now and then. And sometimes I destroy them as a way to kind of transfer the energy and disperse it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like thinking about spreading ashes into like an ocean, or um, reintroducing the material into like a nature space. And that's what the sweep piles that I make have a lot to do with. A lot of the sweep piles are kind of discarded things that I no longer want to like have space for or have the energy for. And the first few drawings that I made on materials were like on my parents' wedding album. My parents like had, or my mom had this wedding album where all the pictures were, from the wedding. It was in this original binder, and it was falling apart. So she got a new binder and threw the book away, and I saved that. And I think my mother throwing it away was what gave me permission to then think about engaging with it in a different way. Where before, like I would just kind of like hold on to it and think of it as a sacred thing. And I think like, having, most humanity has this relationship with sacred objects in this way where it's like you can't touch it, you have to leave it alone, you have to put it on an altar. And for me, there's something else that can happen when you actually like use it and spend it and exhaust it and waste it, in the way that it's
Yeah.
meant to be.
I love that. I love
So
the idea that because my question was about like, oh, does it feel like too much of a weight at times to be engaging with these materials that have such rich history? But I love that it's almost like with the discarding of an object, it gives you like permission. And it's almost like this ethical practice of like, now I can
mhm.
reclaim meaning and I can make meaning for myself with this. Um,
Yeah,
which is like an interesting form of like energetic recycling.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um,
And I
so
think also like living in New York and renting, the idea of renting and being in this space that is occupied by so many people, you're constantly doing that, and thinking about paint as this like device that like renews, and like when you go into a new apartment, all they do is paint all the walls and that's it, it's yours. As this kind of blank page for me, it's like really interesting because beneath the paint there's every other paint that everybody else engaged with. Um, and so I think like living in New York, especially, like you're constantly dealing with this um, like killing of materiality and energy transfer, where you're kind of just shifting constantly, and passing through spaces that like have been touched and experienced and engaged with by so many people and so many other kind of lives.
Yeah, totally. I'm just thinking about like just that experience that happens when you live in New York City long enough where you like have walked the same path all the time, but then it's like that didn't used to be here. And you start to
Right.
forget what came before, you know, it just because like that
Hmm.
institutional memory can start to slip away because you become so used to things being repurposed like
Yeah.
over and over again. And you just have
Hmm.
to you create new meaning out of that consistently. Um,
Yeah.
I want to return to because you mentioned earlier about like comic books kind of being your start. And what I love is how that's like maintained, right? It's not like you went through some phase as a kid where you were like Batman. You were like Batman, and then you got older and you were like Batman.
Yeah.
So actually, could we go forward to like Batman leaving, which I think is just the next one,
Hmm.
possibly? Yeah. So this is Batman leaving new shoes. And then I think the next one, No Me Llame,
Hmm.
which is hysterical to me. You know,
Yeah.
like don't call me. It's like the bat signal, but don't call me. So like we're seeing these same motifs coming through, but it's like funny, but also bittersweet. Like it's like now we're sort of humanizing this
Hmm.
superhero, and it's like we see him leaving, going away from us, and then we're seeing like the bat signal, but it's like don't call me, you know,
Yeah.
like so yeah, I don't know, I would just love to hear you talk about like what first, well no, I mean I think you've talked a little bit about what first drew you to comic books, but you could talk about that, but I think I'm most interested in hearing you talk about like how that has stayed consistent in some ways. It's like evolved, but it's stayed important to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think the part about comic books that drew me in the most was thinking about the idea of world building. And I would say like Batman, X-Men, and Spider-Man were kind of my primary kind of like sources in a lot of ways because they were based in New York.
Yeah.
And Gotham is like, loosely based on New York and Chicago, but it felt very much connected to like a city in decay, a city like just kind of being motivated by corruption, by political corruption and criminal enterprise. So it resonated in a lot of ways with what was happening just in my life and what I was observing as a kid. Um, but there's this idea also that like Batman also being part of this kind of like wealthy elite,
Mhm.
as Bruce Wayne, and him having the kind of access that gave him permission to be this like steward or vigilante or caretaker for a city. Like that didn't sit well with me as an adult. So, reconsidering Batman and my relationship to that, um, shifted into thinking about, okay, how do I get rid of Bruce Wayne?
Mm.
So Batman leaving is just Bruce Wayne leaving. And me like, no me llame, like this bat signal that's like originally I made it into a light box and it was kind of had a peephole in it, so you have to look into it to get your own personal bat signal. So it
Yeah.
wasn't a bat signal that's projected into the sky, but more like you look into it and it's kind of like this isolated, trapped, signal. And I think like getting rid of Bruce Wayne and rethinking about the Batman narrative in my own terms and inserting myself into it um, was really important. And for me, the Batman energy as it evolved in my work had more to do with an energy you possess, and anybody could be Batman. Anybody could use Batman in whatever way they want, and it's kind of this hereditary, like handed down thing, as opposed to like this role, this kind of noble idea of somebody kind of saving a city. Um, and yeah,
When did
thinking.
that shift occur for you? You know, because that is like the sort of
Mhm.
democratization of like of Batman is fascinating to me. And also like the phrase getting rid of Bruce Wayne, you know, you're like, we gotta just off Bruce Wayne. He's not
Yeah.
like where, you know, where in your experience of evolving alongside of the comics and that story did it start to feel like, wait a second. Like,
Hmm.
do you identify that with a particular time in your life?
Yeah. I mean, I think like Chris Nolan's Batman, like the with Christian Bale, like that was a really um that movie made me ask a lot of questions because he was asking a lot of questions. Like he added practicality to so many things around Batman. Like why does he have these spikes on his forearm? Like all these things that, got answered in his movies became really interesting for me. So I started thinking about why in comic books are Batman's eyes like all white? Like that's never something that gets, addressed.
Hmm.
And the only time I can kind of identify with, somebody's eyes being all white is when your eyes roll to the back of your head and when you're possessed. Um, so then I started thinking about Batman and relationships like Afro-Caribbean faith and the idea of possession and the idea of like using a body as a vessel to contain a spirit. Um, for me, was a good opportunity to think about Batman in that way, where he's like an energy you possess and not something that like is limited to one person. It could be passed around, it could be manipulated, it could be altered. And I feel like those two things, thinking about possession and thinking about adding practicality to the story of Batman and answering questions that comic books just don't because they're more fantastical,
Yeah.
was when everything kind of started shifting. And thinking about Rudy Giuliani and thinking about in that last drawing, I don't know if you want to go back to that. I think a lot about yeah, like what are the antagonists in the story? Like what's this world that I'm building? And for me, like Ed Koch and Giuliani were the two mayors that kind of took up the most real estate in my childhood.
Hmm.
So for me, they're like, yeah, they're on the other end of that kind of like thinking about saving a city or something like that. So yeah, for me, it's thinking about world building and thinking about, or comic books set me on a path of like understanding that I'm building a world that's related to this world, but not necessarily it to a T. So it's, it gives me a chance to kind of be playful with things and move things around.
Yeah, and also the sort of the ways in which you're treating like sort of fantasy and like political reality, and treating them like with
Hmm.
this equal investment and like what is the story, what's the narrative here, and yeah, and what kind of power is being communicated or denied from us
Hmm.
by viewing these figures in this way is
Yeah.
really fascinating to think about. Um, can we go to Batman is defeated by the Five Lions? I think we
Mm.
have that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I just like this because we're seeing that imagery like coming through in a different way here with the painting. Um, but one of the other things I was really intrigued by because I'm a words person as much as like a, probably more so than a visual person, um, is that, it says first completed. Um,
Hmm.
So, which, to me implies like how many times can something be completed? So I just want to hear about that from you and how completion and revisiting things, yeah, like how that works for you in your artistic process.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have a really complicated relationship to finishing, and I think um Charlie's good now, but I used to make him really nervous. And he'll still ask me, like I had recently something go to auction and we had the privilege of being able to buy it back. And he's like, "Do you want to work on it?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, duh." So I think like for me, I try not to treat deadlines and try not to treat sales as moments where something finished, but that's kind of when something leaves my studio. Um, and when I'm working on something, I really try to find um or I'm seeking kind of a moment in the painting where I can kind of continue working on it endlessly. It's like almost finding it's like finding a good baseline. It's like I'm trying to create a baseline that I can just play on top of. And for me, a painting is finished when I can like do anything and not ruin it. And it's really
What does
about
that
finding this.
mean? That sounds so impossible to me and so fascinating. But it's like
Yeah,
you want to get it to a point where you could do anything to it.
yeah. Because then it becomes real. Because then it's like it has nothing to do with me anymore. It's about it, and it's
Yeah.
about like its own identity. It's like it's like meeting a person. It's like when you meet a person, you can like yell at them, fight them, kiss them, love them, but that doesn't change who they are. So with the painting, it's very similar. I try to kind of understand it as this like living thing that like I'm in communion with, and not that I'm forcing to become something.
Hmm.
Um, and similar to people, like if you're in a relationship with anybody, whether it's a friendship or romantic, as soon as you start saying like, "Oh, you'd be great if you were dot dot dot," that's it. The relationship is over. So I try not to do that to the paintings either. It really is about like extracting what the painting is and then
Yeah.
playing with it and then enjoying it and then having this relationship with it. Um,
How do you know when you've gotten to that point? Is it just like a gut instinct, a feeling?
it's yes, so it's definitely a gut feeling, but I feel like I can start to recognize things, and I tend to like it's like if I do something to the painting and I start pacing around, I'm like, yes, then that's kind of when I know it's really about like not seeing too much of myself in it after I'm making something. It's so hard to explain.
So
But it's
it's
kind
like
of a
it
gut
becomes a
feeling.
separate entity from you.
Yeah,
But you
yeah,
also created it. Yeah. So it's an
yeah,
interesting tension there. And how
yeah.
common is that? Like, I know that that's something we've talked about before, where you're like, I want to get some of these paintings back so I can keep working on them. How
Hmm.
common is that, like, with artists? Like, are you among many people who are trying to get things back so you can continue to work on them?
No,
Um,
I mean, I don't think anybody, I don't hear anybody talk about this. And I think a lot of people are like, why would you want something back? You know,
yeah.
and it's like, it's done, it's out in the world, like, let it go, you know? And I think some of that is true. I think there's like a hoarding mentality of kind of like understanding that these are always mine, even if somebody bought them, like that painting is still mine.
Yeah.
And they have something of mine in their home and they're kind of like fostering it in a lot of ways. But yeah, my ideal dream life would be for me to like have all my paintings and see them together. Like
In like a
um
giant museum or gallery of your own.
no, just in my studio. Like I just want them all back in my studio because I think there's paintings for me it's wild that I have paintings that never met. Like that just like that's weird.
Wait,
And
what
you
do you
know
mean
for
by
them
that? You
to
have paintings you've never met.
I have paintings that never seen each other. Like
Ah, I see. There we
you
go. Okay.
know, and I think that that would be really interesting for even like the slideshow. Like I would never put the sequence together. And seeing them like
Yeah.
this is so exciting because it's like it's a grouping that for me, um, it's I get a chance to see them live on their own. It's like they just got a bunch of roommates or something,
Yeah.
and
So
I'm like, oh,
what
this is cute.
what in your mind becomes possible when, like, with this fantasy? I love this fantasy of like all of your paintings being in, it would have to be a very large studio space because you have a
Mhm.
lot of them. But like, what do you feel like it becomes possible if they're all there and they all meet each other?
I feel like I get to see something new. I get to discover them for the first time again.
Yeah.
And I'd say I get to see kind of like um how things that like I haven't seen are still informing me. Um, like there's a painting that I sold out of grad school that for me is like the painting. It's like that's where I peaked. And it's like 8 by 8 inches, very small painting. And I keep like chasing that painting in my other paintings.
Hmm.
And I think like, you know, seeing that now at this point in my life, at this point in my practice, would I don't know, it might make me shift into something totally different. But and I think that there's a lot to say about holding on to things. That's a
Yeah.
lesson I'm learning now. You know, there's always like this eagerness to sell, this eagerness to have shows. But it's the paintings that I didn't sell that like for years I'm like, damn, this is a good painting. Like, why hasn't anybody bought it? But I'm so grateful that I still have them.
Yeah.
Because I'm still learning from them and they're for me, they're like indexes or they're like legends or not legends as in like the legend of something, but like a map legend. So something that has a kind of iconography and vocabulary that like I'm still pulling from and I'm using as a resource.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a real sense of like grief around it. Like, we've talked about this before a lot because
mhm,
it blows my mind, right? Because like as a writer, I always have access to my own words. And like of course you can see smaller versions of your paintings, but like to not be able to experience them the way they were originally manifested.
mhm,
And yeah, just hearing you talk about it hits home how that can really deprive you of like an ease that might come, like, of evolving your vision and your work through that experience of being able to be surrounded by that work, to draw from that work, especially
yeah,
because there's like these icons and imagery and motifs that are consistently recurring and shifting and evolving.
mhm,
Yeah. I wanted to talk about, can we go to the Stewart Porter doll? I think it's the next one.
mhm, yeah.
Um, so first of all, I'd just love to hear you talk about this painting a little bit, like what inspired it, what spurred it. But also it's called steward, parenthetically porter doll. And I know that you've worked as a porter, a doorman, and you even entitled a show, Steward, the Ballad of a Super Super. So yeah, I just want to hear you talk a little bit about your relationship to those, both this painting, but also those concepts.
Sure. So when I was a doorman slash porter, um, that was kind of my first introduction to, I don't know, like having an intimacy with the building and having this like real relationship with the building on my own, like a one-to-one relationship. So part of my job as a porter was also to like light handyman work. So I would like fix pipes or like take walls down or like cut holes into walls and things like that. And it just gave me an access to like a lived in space that I've never had before. It was really similar to kind of finding my, my fascination with like paper and like used paper. It's this idea that like I'm the only one that gets to see this, like the guts of a building. Like I would clean the tops of the boilers. I would like clean under the water tank on the roof and all these things where I'm like, there's probably been 4 people up here in the history of this building. Um, so I felt like I had a really kind of intense relationship with the building where I was like talking to it and like understanding what it needed and understanding like when it needed to be alone. And being a doorman, like I worked the midnight to 8 shift often, which meant I was really alone with the building. And it was really, it kind of brought me back to the building that I grew up in a lot of ways and seeing that through a very different lens. And although like, my family like rented and my mother still rents the apartment and we don't own it, it felt like something worth taking care of and documenting and being more in tune with than it had been before. And I think there's so much space in New York that gets taken for granted where like nobody's really thinking about. Like there's these like ramps under the George Washington Bridge that connect from Haven Avenue to the river. That's like been a homeless encampment forever. And I would go down there often and like, it's not dangerous. It's not like something to be scared of. And for me, it's things like that that I want to kind of like keep doing and keep like engaging with as a way to have this intimate relationship with the city. And I think a porter is like, initially your job is to do that. It's to kind of take care of everything that the super and the handyman are taking care of. And sitting on the sidewalk, I feel like is also something that like I did a lot as a kid. Um, and it kind of grounds me in thinking about New York as this like other kind of nature. I heard somebody recently say that living in a city, you lose your sense of like sound, your sense of smell, your sense of sight because you're kind of like in this constructed space. But I disagree with that. I think that there's a second nature that can kind of develop in the city, um, that is very much about like something earthly, something biological, and something like really physical, that has nothing to do with like what the city purports to be all the time, which is this fast-paced metropolis. It's also like a physical space that contains energy, and I feel like being a steward in this painting especially is about thinking about those things. So there's like this helmet that this person's wearing, and the helmet is at once like a radio transmitter and a radio receiver, and it grows crystals, and it has this plant, this flower that kind of absorbs all that energy and like dies and gets reintroduced to the dirt, and a new flower grows. So it's kind of thinking about um how to cleanse a space, how to cleanse a space of energy, how to cleanse a space of um negative things, but also how to protect like um portals. I feel like I'm going everywhere right now. So that little
No, it's great.
triangle that little triangle above the head is
Yeah.
kind of, I'm showing you like 2 different perspectives in the brick. So it's like kind of impossible and it's not like realistic. And the idea is that there's this like kind of portal space into that dark triangle that like also the steward is protecting. And also the small little gated space. I think there's so much space in New York that like you see that I'm like, what is this protecting? What was this enclosing at one point? Like what is this like little gated 4 by foot space? Like what? um and it's for the things that we can't see. And I think thinking about ancestors, thinking about um past lives, or thinking about street altars and how there's like so much that happens on a sidewalk,
Yeah.
so this painting kind of points to protecting that like history and that energy in these spaces that not everyone gets to um understand fully.
And I love that we just got to hear you like describe what the meanings of all like many of these objects that appear in the painting, like what they symbolize, because like you are such a narratively driven artist. Like and I guess I'm curious to know, especially given like the conversation we were just having about like the strangeness of the art world in which like you create something, then like off it goes to like be in someone's living room, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like you are constructing like a very vast, rich like language of imagery and story. And yet like how often do people, you know, they're going to come to a gallery, see your work, um, but you have such involved, elaborate stories behind the pieces. How does it feel to like be putting that out to the world and to not necessarily have those people who are taking it in, that audience, like understand that like depth of narrative that's living there?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I feel like it took me all these years to make the story, so it's gonna take you all the years to read it. Like it's not like with I trust that with time they will kind of unpack themselves. But I don't, I mean, very rarely does somebody kind of like get things on the head and get things in the way that's like directly to what I was intending.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, it feels like I don't know. I feel like in the early part of my like life, I was like sad about that part. I was like, damn, like I really want people to know. I want to write something to like kind of like explain these things that's tied to the paintings, or like the title is an opportunity to kind of give you an entry point to what the painting might be.
Yeah.
Um, but I try to resist that because I feel like it's much more interesting to just put the thing out there and let it exist.
Yeah.
And for me to understand what it means, and I do write about my own work, so I'll take notes about on things, and that's gonna be like found when I die in my studio. Um, so yeah, I trust that like with the few people that do get it, that there's kind of like a general understanding that it will kind of evolve into something that's fully understood. But
Yeah.
yeah, when I think about audience, I really do think about like impressing one or two people with each painting. Like I'm not thinking about like the larger audience necessarily.
Yeah.
And I am interested in beauty, and I do want to make these things beautiful and like attractive and seductive, and luring in a lot of ways. So I feel like yeah, it's like kind of luring you in with like the paint and then like pushing you out with the story.
I
um,
love what you said about audience, you know, and this focus on like
yeah.
one to two people. Do you feel like that one to two people is always kind of shifting and changing at particular times?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
But you're always
yeah,
thinking like on a small scale of like this is, I'm imagining this person seeing
yeah,
this person
yeah,
engaging. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, one of the, so hearing you talk about being you know, a steward yourself, a porter, a doorman, one of the things that we've talked about in the past that I find really interesting is like just hearing you talk about it now, it's so clearly such a integral part of your understanding of the city, your understanding of, and because of that inherently, your understanding of art and painting and creating work. And I know a lot of times it ends up like in the press when people write about you becoming this sort of like almost like Cinderella narrative projected on you, like a very capitalist driven, like rags to riches story, which just
Mm-hmm,
feels very counter to how you talk about it. Yeah, I guess
mm-hmm,
I'd like to hear you talk about that experience of having that narrative projected on you.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then maybe like, are there narratives about yourself that you rarely see acknowledged in coverage of you that you wish were more present?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the that Cinderella type narrative is important. I'm not gonna lie. I think it is important for people to understand that like I do have a particular trajectory that's introduced me to this life,
Yeah,
um, in a way that really spans kind of like a lot of different kind of yeah, accesses to wealth, accesses to um art in a lot of ways. But I do think that it's, you know, I have much deeper curiosities. And I
yeah,
think like my interest in, you know, the cosmos, my interest in comedy, my interest in um microscopes and things like that, like science especially, like I think aren't as romantic when you're talking about it in press. And I feel like that's so I want to be able to share stories about myself that are much more local and much smaller. I think that, you know, for the last few years, a lot of the press is still kind of on this like introductory energy and introducing me as an artist and like um presenting me in a way, you know, assuming that a lot of people don't know who I am. And I still think there's like a lot of people who don't know who I am, but I would much rather like to share stories that are much more about like this walk that I took, or listening to a song that for the first time after not hearing it since high school, for instance. Thinking about these smaller things that happen that are informing like the larger way of me moving around the world would be much more interesting.
Yeah.
But I feel like, you know, a lot of publications try to get as much information as possible to create kind of this like historical context for who I am.
Yeah.
And now I'm excited to reach the point where I can just talk about like a conversation I had with my friend Michael about
Yeah.
music or something like that, and have something much more intimate
Does
shared.
it feel like those kinds of narratives are restricting you to some extent? I guess because, you know, like I teach creative nonfiction, but I have a background like in, you know, short fiction, journalism, but also like activism. And there's a way in which like depending on the spaces I'm in or what I'm being asked to do, there can be this like pressure to wear a very particular hat,
Yeah.
or perform to certain expectations. Do you feel like so when you're engaging with these narratives, whether it's like this is a painter, this is like, you know,
Hmm.
a doorman turned painter, um, you know, like do you feel this pressure to perform a particular kind of identity in order to remain more legible or to get funding, you know, like, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, you know, when I'm putting together images for like, you know, for instance, funding, I am very aware of who the audience is, who the jurors are, and I'm trying to kind of help them, give them paintings and show them images that'll help them kind of understand what they're looking for in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And that can be restrictive at times, but I think, again, like I feel like I have um, a lot of different themes that I cover, from themes that are like very kind of serious about identity or loss and things like that, to things that are upright, like downright silly. And I
Yeah.
think making sure that in my practice I'm able to like express myself in all of the different ways that I want to, and not just kind of like cater to anything,
Yeah.
is important. But I feel like the catering does happen when I'm applying to jobs or applying to um, like opportunities for funding for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I also, yeah, I think that there's good things and bad things about that, but it's not all kind of bad, I would say. But it is kind of it can be limiting.
Yeah. And maybe related to that, could we go back to it goes in your fist in your pocket, the one with the eye?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk to me a little bit about this painting. Yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah. So I had like, so I made this painting for Basel in 2024, no, 2023 or 24. I'm so lost with these like years. But basically, it was around the time where there was a lot of pushback with artists who were making paintings in protest to the war between like Israel and Palestine. And people were either really afraid, people were being blacklisted, people were being not included in conversations or in shows. Um, and I felt like I had this opportunity to kind of like show something in a space, and kind of be discreet with like what I'm actually making the painting about, and to speak to that discreetness. I didn't want to just make a painting that's like secretly about, um, you know, secretly in protest. And so it's about the kind of discreetness that I'm feeling I have to kind of navigate with. And it goes in your fist in your pocket. The idea is that this hand is holding this like watermelon seed that's also like kind of an all-seeing eye. Um, and that like not all protest is visible. You know, the idea that you can still protest and your hand is in your pocket, your fist is still like flexed, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and I think there were a lot of artists who would like write to me and tell me, you're not posting anything about Palestine in your Instagram feed, you're not protesting enough, you're not being like activist enough. And I think that there's a spectrum of activism that people aren't necessarily aware of all the time. And I think that there's people who are doing things behind the scenes in protests, and to kind of complicate or twist the knife a little bit in ways that they couldn't do if they were being very public about it.
Yeah.
And this is what this felt like for me. It felt like an opportunity to sell something, and to think about this like big machine of selling things, which is Basil, and to put this painting in there and to kind of have it speak to those things in a way that like aligns with who I actually am, you know?
Yeah.
And I think I don't want it to be confused for like a fear of um
Speaking up.
protesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm not like afraid of speaking up. It's just like this is how I speak up.
Yeah.
And I think that there's like, I don't know, it's important for me to have experienced other people kind of protest quietly and protest in ways that like um I feel like are safer for me, but I feel like there's other like I need the loud people to be loud. Like I need that.
Yeah.
And I think that there's more of a need for all of us to kind of like share space and take care of each other in a way that like aligns with who we actually are and the energy we can like spend safely.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I appreciate that, right? I think a lot of times what gets lost in the space of like engagement with what's going on politically or currently is the understanding that it's an ecosystem and that we all can be, engaging and working towards the same goals, and it can look very different, and we actually all need each other in order to get somewhere.
yeah,
But yeah, just for
yeah.
folks who aren't aware, that the watermelon seed, that symbolism is related to like in the 60s and beyond, when there were laws and restrictions against the Palestinian flag. The watermelon became a symbol because it's using the same colors as the Palestinian flag. It was like a way to still reference Palestine without risking going afoul of those laws and regulations. Um, so totally unsurprisingly, there's so much more that I want to ask you about, but we only have 5 minutes left. I just looked at the time.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
so I'm going to give you a few options, Kenny. Do you want to talk
Okay.
about like race and identity and kind of like being a Dominican painter and like what they're artists and what that means? Do we want to look at layers in your paintings and kind of like what people don't always get
Mm.
to see? Um, or do you want to talk about abstraction?
Those are all the same thing.
Damn you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can talk about all of it. I think that there's a way that I understand like Dominican identity and like Afro-Dominican identity, or like an identity as being a New Yorker, that is really about layers, and it really is about kind of expanding what that idea can mean. I think a lot of times as an artist, especially like you're encouraged to find a niche. You're encouraged to find like a particular vantage point to speak from all of the time.
Yeah.
And I like complicating that idea, and I like thinking of like this idea of Dominicanness and like Afro-Caribbeanness as like something that is expanded in every single thing that I do. So I
Yeah.
think like as a way to complicate it, like I try to think about like being in the desert. Like I feel like, coming out here and loving being out here, I feel like people are always questioning, like, really? Like, wouldn't you much rather be in like the Dominican Republic? I'm like, yes, I would, but it's also like my relationship to the Caribbean and to that nature makes me so much more aware of the planet. And I think like having this planetary relationship as a Dominican is something I see as being Dominican.
Yeah.
Um, and I think being a New Yorker is very similar too. And thinking about like, being a New Yorker is very like um framed by this kind of loyalty and this kind of like camaraderie and this very intense energy that can be really isolating. And I think of, like whenever I leave New York and spending time anywhere outside of New York as strengthening that relationship.
Yeah.
And being kind of again thinking about that identity as being much more expansive with every single thing that I do. And I think abstraction and the way that I layer paintings connects to that in a lot of ways, where abstraction for me is almost like the goal. Like I want to make like I don't know, it's not the goal, but I feel like if it were up to me, I would just make these abstract field color paintings in a lot of
Yeah,
ways. But
can we like fast forward? I'm so old and analog.
fast
But yeah,
forward,
could we move forward to just some of the more like abstract paintings? Perhaps, for instance, like pink windows, or actually flowers on a night swim would be perfect. I think that's later on.
sure.
So yeah, and one of the things, because you and I have talked about abstraction and like I think within the context, both of us have talked together about sometimes feeling hemmed in by having a certain style or feeling like we have to represent a certain identity in our work. And there's this
Mhm.
desire to like go beyond that and just like, create something that's not immediately understandable and legible.
Yeah.
And one of the quotes that really haunts me that I think about a lot from James Baldwin, he said in the introduction to his first book of essays, "I've not written about being a Negro at such length because I expect that to be my only subject, but only because it was the gate I had to unlock before I could hope to write about anything else." So,
Yeah.
that I know that quote, but then also like in your monograph, you have a quote there, from an interview. It's almost like I'm not making the paintings that I should be making. I'm making these paintings so that I can make those paintings later. I also feel an urgency and responsibility around storytelling. So I just wanted to put those two things next to each other
Mhm.
because I feel like they're related. And I just love to hear you, like, as a final question, like reflect on that, because we're talking about abstraction, because you're kind of talking
Mhm.
about where you're headed and what your sort of dreams are in terms of like where you're going to go as an artist and a creator.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's, like I said in the interview, like the responsibility to represent, the responsibility to tell these stories. There's an urgency to like making sure that like the history of, my family or my community is documented.
Yeah.
So that it's not overlooked, so that we do have a presence in like the larger conversation of things. Um, but yeah, like I think the goal, it's like what would happen if we didn't have to fight anymore?
Yeah.
What's going to happen when there isn't the resistance to who we are, where everything's like acceptable? It's like, what are you going to paint then? So I think that there's a lot of like, I don't know, artists, people, other kinds of creatives that kind of like want to stay in this loop. I
Yeah.
do not. I think
Yeah.
that like there's a purpose for it. There's a purpose for having to tell these really hard, traumatizing kind of stories, but then for what? And it's
Yeah.
like so that I can write about flowers on a night swim. And it's a painting that I finished twice. Before it was called I'll Save the First Swim for You. And then it became Flowers on a Night Swim. And it's still connected to identity in so many ways because it relates to two stories with the original painting and this painting, but both having to do with the Hudson River. And then creating, and it's kind of thinking about an offering to Oshun, which is one of the deities in the faith that I practice, which is Ifa. And so, yeah, the identity is built into it, but it's also this kind of like very small story of thinking about the flowers that I threw into the river as floating in unison down the river to like this more like, I don't know, like parallel universe, or they're like transforming into like this different space.
Yeah.
So the storytelling is still there, but I felt like this painting is, I want to say one, two, it's four moves. This painting is four moves. And that kind of simplicity and that kind of like trust and faith into like the mark making,
Yeah.
and letting the paint just be itself, for me, is abstraction. It's like being in unison with the material, but also like kind of controlling the image a little bit, but letting it just kind of be itself. It's something that I'm really interested in. Kind of making like quieter paintings that aren't always like claustrophobic and congested and like filled with every little thing. Like I want to make a painting with like three things.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like that's you know something that I weave into my practice now, but ultimately like it would be great if I can just do that for like 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, and to be able to trust, like it sounds like trust is involved in that too, when you're
Yeah.
emphasizing like the sort of limited number of motions or moves. Uh yeah, I mean, I think we have to move to Q&A, but I
Okay.
think if we can put up one last image, because what's interesting is seeing this and knowing that it's a limited number of moves, and then compare this to like a different work, like so if we could go to Church Flowers, which is the one that's like a mirror, and there's
Mm-hmm.
flowers in it. Yes. So I couldn't send this to you, Eleanor, in time, but this is what that originally looked like.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an
Yeah.
earlier permutation of that painting, meaning like, which is just something I wanted to make sure we touched on with a lot of your work. There are all these paintings underneath the quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote final painting,
Right.
um, which I know all visual artists, like especially with painting, there's often something underneath there, but I feel like you sort of take it to another level.
Yeah, well, I think of it as another painting. So this painting is two paintings, and that other painting that you just held up is a separate painting than this. While they exist in the same surface, they're two different histories and two different kind of moments of me understanding what the surface was kind of speaking about. And I think it was the first time where I was kind of funny about like vision of this other painting, but it's the actual painting, but it's a reflection. And it's also kind of thinking about how space transforms, and like maybe there was like an empty lot here, now there's a building covering up what was here before. But there's still something behind it. And then thinking about this mirror as a device to kind of reveal something, and you know, the mirror also as this thing that reveals who you are. And thinking about I was just talking about the Puck building. I don't know if you ever you know about the publication Puck from the 1900s. But it's like this on Houston and I want to say Lafayette, there's a Puck building, and it's like the Puck figure in the corner of the building with the mirror to society kind of thing. So it's this idea of yeah, this mirror reflecting more than what you're ready to engage with all the time. But yeah, like I like thinking about yeah, like older paintings as being kind of infused and part of like the larger story.
Yeah, even when like the viewer has no idea what's underneath there.
No idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you derive some joy from that.
Absolutely.
Like keeping that
Yeah.
secret to some extent.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
what you choose to conceal versus reveal. Well, great.
Yeah.
I think we should stop. I don't know whether, should we just go to Q&A? I could also read that last poem. It's up to you guys.
Maybe we can do the Q&A and
Yeah.
then do the reading.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds great.
Cool.
This conversation has been so brilliant. Thank you so much, Kenny and Onnesha. This has been just so inspiring. We've got some great questions here from the audience. So our first question will be from Nicole. And Nicole, I will allow you to unmute here. Or I can also ask on Nicole's behalf. Nicole wrote, Kenny, when I first met you and experienced your work, your paintings reflected a situational color scheme, a truly local color that spoke to your immediate domestic NYC environment that operated in a metaphorical way. Can you talk a bit about your relationship to / use of color in your paintings now?
Yeah. Hi, Nicole. How are you?
Sorry, Don. It just let me unmute myself.
Sorry
Cool.
about that. Well, feel free to chime in, Nicole, and add in anything.
No, that was the question. And, you know, I unfortunately couldn't join until 1:30, so I don't know if you guys addressed that already. But yeah, that's just my curiosity because, you know, when I initially, you know, knew your work and worked with you, yeah, I think that was something that was very strong in the work and actually gave the work sort of like a power and identity and separated it from a lot of, you know, other things that we were seeing at the time. So yeah, I want to know a little bit more about, you know, the way for you that's evolved, or, you know, or how that situates itself now, your relationship to color in your current work.
I think it's really similar to what it was when we first met. It's very rooted in memory. Like I like, or for the most part, when I mix color or I create like a palette for a painting, it starts from thinking about memories that I reflect on, or colors that I reflect on, and not so much thinking about creating a phenomena with like color as a device. So thinking about the pink that I use, thinking about the blues that I use, they're rooted in like, you know, thinking about like the homes in the Caribbean and the way the colors that they're painted in, but applying that to like a New York landscape or a New York architecture. So it really is like a material for me and not so much like just an image kind of phenomenon. And I love color, and I think a lot about like color from my past. I think about color from advertising. I think about color from signage, and using those colors as a way to kind of unpack those histories too, or point to those histories. Um, but yeah, color for me is a way to point at a past or to point to memory in a lot of ways. Yeah.
No, just, yeah, interesting. And, you know, I think in your work at that time too, I felt like a redefining or being able to look into a Dominican New York experience. And I kind of feel now, you know, following your work now, that there is this, it's more, even more specific to sort of the Caribbean Dominican kind of experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And I do love artists like Ben Shahn and Martin Wong, as thinking about people who are looking at the city and thinking about people who are documenting buildings and architecture and relationships of people too. But I didn't necessarily feel connected with their palettes all the time, because there was this like Caribbean energy and my history, which kind of living there every summer, that like made sense in the landscape too. And yeah, I think that there's like a darkness that I feel like New York is depicted a lot with paintings that I think that there's a lot more light that I see in it. So, and it's like a Caribbean light, if that makes sense.
I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Nice
you.
chatting.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Those were such great questions. And thanks, Kenny, for your generous answers.
Yeah.
Our next question is from Caroline, and I will ask on Caroline's behalf. Caroline wrote, "Your ideas seem deeply connected to energy. Has this concept, focusing on energy, always been central to your artistic vision, even before developing your signature style?"
Oh, it's a big question. Do I have a signature style? I don't know if I have a signature style, and I don't see it that way. I mean, it probably appears that way, but I think um the relationship to energy like has to have always been there. I feel like I became aware of it. I want to say like, I don't know, maybe undergrad. So like between 2006 and 2000 like 10, I started to really look at my old drawings as a kid and understanding that I've been doing the same thing that I've been doing since kindergarten, and it's always had to do with energy. It's just like a skill set maybe changed. Um, but I think yeah, like for me, it's always about like um thinking about object making as an imprint or as a way to kind of like um create something. I don't know. It's like a way to kind of leave something behind that literally is the evidence of energy kind of flowing through you and something else. Um, in the way that a conversation can kind of like work that way. But I feel like I've always been kind of in tune with like um spirituality, with ancestors, with kind of thinking about that as energy before I even thought about it, in the framework of my art. But yeah, I've always kind of been in tune with like spirits and things like that, and understood that that's something that I'm contending with constantly.
Amazing. Thank you. And thanks, Caroline, for the question. I would like to ask a question to you, Kenny, about language. Really love what you said earlier in the beginning of this conversation about writing as drawing and just the way you integrate words into your practice. And I'm wondering if you could talk about English and Spanish in that context and in terms of the development of the kind of narrative aspects of your work and how you think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I first started really putting, or I would say not when I first started, but in undergrad, I started working with like Spanish into the text as a way to kind of resist this like English framing of everything. And then soon after, I realized that Spanish is also a colonizer's language. Um, so I think like being in control of the two, combining the two, messing them up is a way to kind of resist um, this like yeah colonizer's hold. And I think like there's still beauty in both languages. So I'm not trying to kind of frame it as something I want to like obliterate or anything like that. But just acknowledging that both come from this like larger legacy of violence is really important. And then transforming that into like beauty, I think is really important. Like I love poetry, I love writers. The majority of my friends, I would say, are artists and writers. I would say it's like 50-50. And it's because there's a relationship to language that I feel is so like um connected to activism and connected to reclaiming and reintroducing and like reforming something um that's really beautiful. Like slang, I think is really beautiful. Slang for me is a form of like art because it's like literally taking something as material and transforming it to mean something else or to mean the same thing with a different kind of like texture. And yeah, and I think working with Spanish, you know, for me is it's like also connecting to like an ancestry, connecting to the history of my own family, and making my work accessible to them. Like, you know, my mom understands and like speaks a little bit of English, but still not like um a language that she can kind of move day to day with. So for me, it's also kind of connecting with her and connecting with um like not excluding her from the conversation in my work.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Kenny.
Mhm.
Our final question today will be from Chloe.
This conversation was so lovely. Thank you
Oh,
so
cool.
much. It was a pleasure to listen to. Kenny, I have a question for you. I'm curious about what it was like to make this monograph, and if you could talk a bit more about like seeing your work in that format. Especially I'm curious about it after hearing you talk about asking for your paintings back to keep working on them. There's something about a
Mhm.
monograph that's very, it's a unified presentation of a body of work, and I'm curious to hear you
Yeah,
speak on that and about that process for you as an artist.
yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, it was a very long process. It took 3 years
Mhm.
to make around. And I do want to shout out Charles Moffat. He has kind of been so good about like not only kind of building my career and doing like the regular gallery thing, but like creating opportunities where I can just do something else and see my work in a different context. So thank you, Charlie. I love you. And it's really like um it was exciting. It was really slow. We weren't in a rush. Like Charlie was like, I was kind of in a rush at times when Charlie was like, no, let's just do it right. Let's do it once. They had like two different editors, or sorry, two different designers work on it. So it was a really long process, and it was really about a vision. Like there's a lot of things that I wanted to do that, you know, were kind of like for instance, the marbleized paper in the beginning. Um, for me, that's like a nod to like older books and old kind of like bookmaking, and thinking about, yeah, and thinking about like my relationship to paper. And I wanted that to be present in the book without necessarily having to spell it out. Having like a fabric cover, having it hardcover, having an appendix for me was really interesting because that's like again these very old ways of thinking about bookmaking that are like pointing to the history of books. So you know, Charlie made space for all of that to happen, and he was really good about kind of finding the right people to work on it, um, and finding people who were like interested in kind of enhancing that vision. All the contributors and the writers were amazing to work with. They're all my friends, and they're similar to this with me and Onnesha. It's like they're it's kind of like a culmination of like so many years of conversation, you know. So for me, it's like, you know, like yeah, it's this really beautiful document of my experience with my friends for the last few years, and thinking about these conversations, thinking about the work that I was making, and having it in a book, having something that somebody can hold. I love. Like I think that ideally I want everybody to touch my paintings and to like hold the paintings and like be able to feel them and like carry them with them. But that's not very archival. So like having a book kind of creates that opportunity where, you know, we're so used to like Instagram and experiencing paintings digitally. So I think having something on paper reproduced in physical form is really important for me.
Thank you so much for that answer.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
yeah,
pass it over to Eleanor again.
cool.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you so much, and again, Onnesha and Kenny, for this really beautiful conversation. It's so inspiring to so many people, as we can see. And thank you, everyone, for your great questions. To wrap things up today, we're going to have a reading from the monograph, and I'll just let Kenny introduce it.
Cool. So this poem is written by Ana Rocio Milagro, and it's, you know, she's one of the people that I've been kind of art friends with for a very, very, very long time, since 1999. And we've been friends in art. We've been kind of friends in like spiritual practice too. Like she also practices Ifa. We both went to community college together when we first started undergrad. So we had this very, very long relationship of making things together, talking about art. And she's also from Washington Heights, Afro Dominican, or she's Dominican and from St. Thomas, I believe. She's gonna kill me if I get this wrong. But yeah, and I think that this poem kind of like finishing the book was really important for me. As far as like an outro, like on an album or something like that. Like it felt like an important kind of like stamp or marker. But yeah, and it's also the poem for me like addresses so many things that I'm interested in. It's like, you know, our cosmic circumstance and on our planet, energy, spirituality, and ancestorship, but so many things that I feel like I touch on in the book. And the poem was made independently of the book. So she didn't make it a response. She made it kind of like, yeah, it just kind of like lined up. Which was
And
really
out of
great.
curiosity, Kenny, did she want to include the Toni Morrison quote?
Yes. So the Toni Morrison quote is part of it. Yeah.
Great. So I just want to show people visually. There's the Toni Morrison quote on the facing page that says, "All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was." And then this is how the poem itself looks like on the page. It's this beautiful shape. So I'll just be reading it because I happen to have a copy here with me. It's called Fear of Water. Since water has true memory, could it be before gravity perfected its hold, the ocean's other half rose in high tide and unintentionally jumped up too far, floated off, and got stuck? Maybe balled itself up just as it froze, forming into the orbiting moon? Could it be they are spending an eternity tortured, unable to forget that they were meant and made to be together, unwhole without the other, incapable of letting go of the pure love they once shared, and they will forever magnetically pull for one another, stopping at nothing, even if it brings Earth's destruction? They will fight to reunite, or will drown the whole world trying, or maybe ice the galaxy over, blocking the sun, killing us all until they become one again. Would it be wrong to root for them? And that's it.
Nice. Cool.
So beautiful. Thank you
Yeah,
for reading
that was
that,
great.
Onnesha,
Yes,
and
thank
thank
you.
you, Kenny. Congratulations on the monograph. Everyone, please do get a copy. There's a link in the chat to the
Mhm.
book. And a huge thanks as well to Charlie at the gallery at Charles Moffat Gallery for supporting us in preparing for today's NSE. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring this program and for supporting our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. And this conversation will be posted there very soon. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years, and there is going to be a link in the chat to donate to support our writers, production staff, and operations. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Lynn Cook and Suzanne Hudson on woven histories, textiles, and modern abstraction on view at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much again, Kenny and Onnesha, and thank you everyone for being here. And you can turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you
Kenny.
so much.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you
yes,
so
Thank you
much.
so
do get a
much.
copy of this amazing book.
Thank you for the
Bye.
reading. Thank you
Thank
for the
you.
Thank you
questions.
so
Thank you,
much. Bye,
conversation
everyone.
everybody.
today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.